everybody. Great to see you all here and come and share in this event about creativity, a journey to the self. This kind of was born out of my own journey, being a creative. I was a performer all my life. I did my first film acting job when I was 5. My dad was a TV director. My mum was a ballet dancer. And so I started touring at the age of 8 with a ballet company. And so I kind of have done all of the arts from multiple perspectives for all of my life, but always found myself to be something of a sort of detached observer of the human condition, and particularly creative people. With my dad being a TV director at the BBC in London, I grew up on the sets of some of the, most well-known British comedies, seeing these incredibly creative people, in their natural habitat, where their behavior was not necessarily what the public was seeing. And so I was kind of like, oh, this is interesting. Everybody thinks you're this, but I'm seeing this whole thing. I just used to sit and go, I wonder why that is. And, so I was just really absorbed by this. So I really sort of find myself as a research scientist on this planet, just constantly observing people. So it really sort of helped me understand what the origins of creativity are. And then when I moved out of my sort of performance career and I became an osteopath, and I literally trained in that specifically to work with artists, because I was so tired of going to people for treatment who were like, oh, you're a ballet dancer, or oh, you're a singer, or, it's like, you don't get me. Right? We just need to be understood. And when we feel understood, that's a big part of the healing process, right? That we call it the therapeutic alliance. So I wanted to really provide a place where artists felt heard and seen. This is a branch of the medical world called performing arts medicine, which most people don't even know exists. But we have sports medicine, right? But we also have performing arts medicine. And then I became more and more intrigued. I was obviously treating a lot of physical issues that people were having, but suddenly realized that most of the healing was happening because of what we talked about, the stories that came out once we were in the sort of treatment process. So it kind of led me more into the psychology route, because I was like, I need to know what I'm doing here, because I was getting artists coming to me who, it became a sort of confessional in a way. And people were speaking about suicidal ideation and things like that. And I was like, I need to know how to work with this, how to handle it. So I sort of furthered my studies in psychology. And so I now work in psychophysiology. It's the sort of term, the umbrella term for it. What is the psychological, emotional story behind the expression of physical symptoms? And when we look at creative people, we tend to be highly sensitive. We're all labeled the sort of, oh, they're so dramatic. Oh, they're up, they're down, they're this, they're that. So what is that about? Is that actually a fundamental intrinsic part of being creative, or is it just affectation, And I can safely tell you that it's not affectation, and we're going to dive into that. But what I would encourage you to do, thank you for coming on a weekday evening when I know you've all had busy days, and we're probably all a little bit brain fried by this time in the evening. But one of the sort of themes of this workshop this evening will be looking at the difference between connecting with information via the head, or what we think is the head, the mind, the thinking brain, versus actually connecting with information via the body, and actually starting to trust our bodies to tell us what's right, wrong, good, bad, what's truth to you, because truth is not universal. The world is trying to tell you that right now in multiple ways. Checking everything's a fact until proven otherwise. I would say truth is a very unique individual experience, and it's not a thought, it's a feeling. So some of the things I'm sharing with you today, you might find going, oh, I used to teach a course for musicians that some of this content is drawn from, and, they just go, oh, you've explained me. But it's not like, oh, that's an interesting fact. It's, oh, right, it's a felt experience. So I encourage you to leave your heads behind for this, and just relate to it on a physical level. And we're going to start with a little exercise to help us to do that and to begin our journey to the self. Because at the end of the day, as artists, we often have this fabulous idea of where we want to go to, what we want to achieve, what our purpose is. And we created a sort of series of breadcrumbs that we think is going to get us there. But you can know where you want to go, and you can have the best map or GPS system in the world, but if you don't know your starting coordinates, you ain't going to get there, right? You have to know where you're beginning. What are your GPS coordinates from which you can interact with all these things? And as we're going to see, artists often find themselves sort of floating between, oh, I'm doing this, now I'm doing this, and oh, where am I in the middle of all of this? So when we start to find this anchor and this beacon, or this felt sense of self, then life becomes a lot easier. We're going to be talking about stress and the sort of stress component that often goes with creativity. And a huge part of reducing stress is just being able to hold that sense of self and know that's enough, that's good enough. And sort of, one of the things I often, say to people is, there's never anything wrong with you, which is kind of a surprise when they're coming to me with raging back pain or something. There's never anything wrong. There's just some symptoms that are responding to stimuli. And we just need to figure out what is causing that chain of events to manifest as that symptom. The body is never wrong. And I feel, somebody who has studied it in great depth, I used to teach anatomy in the Division of Surgery at University College London. So I've been in the real classical medical world and realized that this sort of pathologization, if that is a word, of things turning everything into a problem. And we're going to be talking a lot about the challenges of creativity, and I don't want you to think that that's a problem. It's nothing wrong. It's just a set of circumstances, and when we know how to deal with them and manage them, then they're not so much of a challenge anymore. So we're going to begin with a little journey just to start to just drop off the energy of where we've been in our day today. So if you're comfortable to do so, it'd be deeper for you if you close your eyes for this one, and get yourself nice and comfortable as you can be. And we're going to shrink ourselves down to a little miniature version of yourself. This is a bit of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids moment. And I want you just to step into your own head, inside your skull. And what you'll find as you walk into this beautiful, cavernous space is it's got a huge cathedral-like vaulted ceiling above you if you look up. And perhaps, like many of the great cathedrals around the world that have domed ceilings, they often have what's called a lantern in the middle, a little hole where the sunlight can stream in, and the photons of light are coming in and dappling this beautiful cavernous space. And you might find that there are some beautiful frescoes painted on the ceiling of that dome. And this is a place that's entirely yours, that you can retreat to any time you like. It is always available to you. You might notice the sound of a fountain trickling away, the beautiful cerebrospinal fluid that bathes our head and all the way down the spinal cord and is the breath of life. As you hang out there, you will notice that at the front of your domed cathedral, there are two portholes, two round windows that look out onto the world. These are our eye sockets. And as you step towards them, you can peer out into what we call reality, the real world. But is it any more real than the one that you're in right now, inside your own head? Who knows? You can choose. And you can choose when you hang out in this space, maybe pull the shades down on those portholes and shut out that noise for a bit. But as you look out from there, perhaps a question you might ask is, who is the person looking out of those windows? Do you know this person? Have you introduced yourself? Might be nice to do every now and then. Just kind of go, hi, how are you doing? What do you think about what happened today? It's kind of a relationship we might never have indulged in before, to check in with that inner version of you. And so now as we raise the shades back up on those windows, let that real world back in, grow yourself back up, Alice in Wonderland style, back up to your full size again, and step into the beautiful bodysuit that you've brought with you this evening. But see if you can hold on to an essence of that person you just met. And then as you open your eyes and bring yourself back to the space, bring that person with you. You notice the difference in energy in the room? One of my jobs when I'm working with people is efficiency. How little effort do we actually have to expend to get the job done, right? We often are using a lot more sort of nervous energy than we need. So recognizing what's extra noise and what's actually required can be really useful. So we can gather a lot more information when we're not sort of in this place of contraction and pushing things away. We're going to be talking about the gut later. If you've tried the beautiful kombucha that's been brought by our wonderful Hannah here today that's so healthy for our guts, we need to be in expansion mode to absorb what we ingest and what we eat. And it's the same with information. So if we're in a contracted state where our mind's very busy, we're often just pushing that information away. So now we're in a more open, expansive place, ready to absorb. We shall dive on in, follow me down the rabbit hole, into a little exploration of creativity. And there's always this question of nature versus nurture. Are we born innately creative, or is it something that develops during our upbringing, the experiences that we have in life? And really, it's a mixture of the two. And so we're going to look at the two different versions of this and look at evidence for both. So there's this kind of reductionist, simplified idea of the creative mind, right? Oh, right-brained people, they're the creative, fuzzy people. And then the left-brained people, they're the serious ones, right? They're the ones that do all the real work in the world. And while there is some validity to that statement, the right hemisphere of our brain is the area that lights up when we are listening to music, when we're interacting with animate objects. So that might be animals, other people, whereas the left brain is more of a closed system. It likes to label things and categorize them. So what's interesting for any musicians in the room is that the right hemisphere lights up when we interact with musical instruments. So you'd think that a musical instrument would be categorized as a tool. If you're using a hammer or a computer, your left hemisphere will light up. But interestingly, we view musical instruments as human, right? It's a human interaction. And most of the instrumentalists I work with, they have names for their instruments and they, have a very human relationship with them. What we also know about the right and left hemispheres is that the right hemisphere controls the movement on the left side of your body and vice versa. So there is actually a lot of crosstalk between the two. And there's an area of the brain called the corpus callosum. I only throw these stupid terms out in case you're a geek like me and you want to know them. There's no quiz at the end, so you don't have to retain this information. And I also let you know as well, I'm going to send out after this event a resource sheet that has all the references that I'm using here, so you can go and do your own little rabbit hole investigations later on, so that you don't have to retain it all now. Just let what wants to absorb come in. So this area of the brain between those two hemispheres is trafficking a lot of information between the two. And what this research paper looked at was they looked at musicians who began playing their instrument before the age of 6. And what they found was those musicians who began their training that early had a larger corpus callosum than their non-musician peers. So it just shows that there's a lot of crosstalk in artists because, yes, we have all this creative drive, and playing an instrument can be very creative, but we also have to do technique, right, and skill acquisition. So when we're in technique learning, we're more in that left hemisphere dominance. but we don't go on stage and do technique, right? Nobody pays to see technique and effort. We have to put that into the background. Yes, it needs to be there, but we need to communicate on a human level through our artistry. So the same with painting as well, for instance. Sometimes you do have to get analytical about things, but then you have to come back to that more felt sense of the piece for the connection to the people who are receiving your art. So if you did train before the age of 6, I would say in dance as well, it's just that there hasn't been a research study on it, you can brag that you have a larger corpus callosum than other people. So this is just as we dive into the sensitivity that we're often labelled with as creatives. This is just a wonderful quote by Pearl S. Buck, who was a wonderful sort of literary figure in the sort of 30s, 40s, and won many prizes for her writing. I'm just going to read this to you because it's just something that just resonates again with many of our creative fellows. And it says that the truly creative mind in any field is no more than this: a human creature born abnormally, inhumanly sensitive. To him, a touch is a blow, a sound is a noise, a misfortune is a tragedy, a joy is an ecstasy, a friend is a lover is a god, and failure is death. Add to this cruelly delicate organism the overpowering necessity to create, so that without the creating of music or poetry or books or buildings or something of meaning, his very breath is cut off from him. He must create, must pour out creation. By some strange, unknown, inward urgency, he is not really alive unless he is creating. So that, whenever I read it, I'm like, oh, yeah. Okay, I resonate with a lot of that, and I'm sure you do too. So what is it that makes us creative? We're getting a little more left hemisphere dominant here now. A little bit of anatomy of the brain. So that's one of these nature arguments. Are there structural differences in brain anatomy and physiology that predict creativity? And the answer is yes, there are. So you're not just crazy, right? There is a biological basis for you. And one of the things that you probably experience as a creative person is that we can get very overwhelmed by stimuli, right? We are bombarded all the time with sounds, with smells, with temperature change, with visual experiences. I would say if you parachuted a primitive human into Times Square at 6 o'clock on a Saturday evening, they'd just be overwhelmed. So we need a means to filter out some of the noise in the environment to be able to focus on a narrow task. And for this study, they were looking at were there differences in this signal filtration between creative people and less creative people. I would say everybody is creative as a human, but people that were more sort of up this end of the spectrum. And their definition of creativity, how they kind of categorized it, was the capacity for divergent thought, holding many streams of thought at once. And again, this may resonate with some of you. It's like, I need to do this, and there's that, and there's a squirrel, and there's an animal, there's a lot of information coming in. And convergent thought is the opposite of that, and that's the ability to focus on a narrow task and just dial out everything else that's around you and not be just like distracted all the time. So if you're anything like me in a restaurant or something, there's so much noise, and I'm like, it's an interesting bass line of that music, and then they're talking about football, or somebody's put their fork down over here, and then I'm trying to have a conversation with someone, I'm like, So we need to dial down the noise. So the thalamus is the area of the brain that acts as a signal filter and helps us to just narrow our world and help us focus on what we're doing and not be distracted. And in order to function, to do this filtration function, it needs dopamine. Now, you've probably heard of this. Dopamine's got quite a good PR agent these days. It's a very complex thing. It has many, many jobs in the body, but we kind of know it as the happy chemical, right? The thing that makes you feel good. But one of its jobs is actually to help us dial down this noise. So the thalamus has little receptors on it that absorb dopamine to help us go, okay, I can make my world go a little narrower. And what they showed in this research study was that creative people up that divergent end of the scale, have fewer receptors for dopamine on their thalamus. So you might have a bigger corpus callosum, but you've got fewer dopamine receptors on your thalamus. So it just basically means we're less able to filter the crazy, right? There's just too much noise coming in. This can also explain the, again, documented research that shows that addictive tendencies are quite prevalent within the creative population. And addiction of any sort, and that could be to something that's not helpful, alcohol, drugs, but it could also just be you're addicted to exercise, you're addicted to something. We can weaponize our addiction to something that actually benefits us, which is, one thing I would suggest. But really what it is a dopamine hunger, okay? What we're looking for when people take illicit drugs, for instance, it's not actually the drugs per se that they're addicted to, it's the dopamine you release in response to taking them. So at the end of the day, we have our own pharmacy in here. We just need to know how to get at it. And with this particular role in creative people, we don't have that ability to get at the dopamine that we have in our system. So we tend to reach for it externally outside of ourselves. Once you hear that, it's just like a relief. Okay, this isn't, again, there's never anything wrong. It's just we are a product of the anatomy we were graced with at birth, and we just need to know how to work with it. So a little bit about dopamine. Now, there's, again, no quiz, don't worry, don't panic, don't go into contraction. I just showed you this slide to show how dopamine works in this instance. It's called a neurotransmitter, which means our neurological system, which is the nervous system, is the electrical messaging system of the body. And it's a bit like a relay race. There's sort of a baton that's passed across several relays until it reaches a target organ. And the relays are little junctions like this. They're little gaps. And dopamine is the little taxi cab that takes the baton from one relay to the next to get a job done. So that's how it's working in the body. So we now know we've got a reduced ability to be able to absorb dopamine in the place that we kind of need it. But the other feature of creative people is we have a bit of a dysregulation issue with dopamine as well. So typically dopamine is a cyclical chemical that is released in sort of peaks and troughs. And for people who are not so far down the creative spectrum, they tend to have nice sort of equal peaks and troughs, a sort of steady flow, rise and fall of dopamine. What's been shown in creative people is that we tend to have highs and lows and highs and lows, right? Peaks, troughs, we're up, we're down, we're up, we're down, right? Again, this is a feature of creativity. And what's interesting, there's a book called The Neurology of Music, if you really want to go down a rabbit hole. It's quite a medical book, but it's got some really interesting research on musicians and composers of historic note who were known to have issues with, shall we say, mood management, what they used to call melancholic depression in their day. Got Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky up there and Beethoven down here. So many of those great composers, Rachmaninoff, Schumann, were all documented to have issues with sort of mood regulation. And what one researcher did was looked at the medical notes of all these famous composers so that you could see when they were having their kind of ups and downs. And then they cross-referenced that with their own personal journals that they'd written, giving their own personal experience. And then they cross-referenced or correlated all that information with the periods of composition. So when were they producing great work and when were they not producing great work, and how did that fit with their mood? And what this showed across all of them was that when they were in their dark phase and, life's not worth living and got no inspiration, they're not producing anything. But because it's cyclical, you will always come back up from that trough, and that's something to know as well. As dark as it may seem, there will be an upward rise. As they started to rise up from that dark place, that's when they started composing. That was when or the inspiration started to come in, and then they're euphoric and suddenly they're like, ta-da, here's my masterpiece, and they're out and performing, getting all the applause, and that's dopamine. It's like everybody loves me and it's all wonderful. And then slowly the applause dies down and things get a little, oh, I'm just still at home on my own with my cat. And we're falling back into that trough again. So this swing is directly correlated to your creative cycle. And again, there's nothing wrong. It may be very uncomfortable, but what I will say is that those darker times are actually the fertile soil for your next burst of creativity, and you wouldn't have it without it. And we know from people that have been medicated out of those mood states, which can be required in some cases. But what they tend to note is that they lose their creativity, they lose their inspiration because they've flattened out the curves. So I always say, seeds need to be buried in soil in the dark before they sprout. So if we can find a time to anticipate it, know it's not wrong, it just is, and know that it is the fertile soil for your next burst of inspiration, and don't expect to have it when you're there. And then it kind of can help you have a better relationship with those times. And you're not alone. Every figure in history had the same thing going on. And what's interesting, there's a wonderful book which I'll put on the resource list by Ian McGilchrist, who tracks artistry from ancient Greece through to current Western world, looking at it through the lens of brain anatomy and how brain anatomy has developed over that time. And what he says is that nature normally will evolve us out of anything that's not helpful, that is perhaps damaging to us as humans, if it serves no purpose. So it can be very uncomfortable being an artist if you have these peaks and troughs of mood. So why haven't we evolved out of that? What is the purpose that it serves? And what he says is that creativity is the driver of evolution. It's the creative people who mirror society back to itself and go, look at it this way, how about this? Because they've got that divergent thought, whereas everyone else is going, well, we've always done it this way, why should we change, right? It's the artists who make that shift, and we drive progress and evolution. So without that, if nature were to evolve us out of that, we'd grind to a halt in terms of our evolution. So we are the front guard, right? We are there, and I think now more than ever, the creators are needed, and that's why I'm passionate about helping people to understand their creativity and work with it, because we are the ones that are going to move things forwards, and we're at a big shift in the world right now, in the universe right now, I would say. This is where we start to harness this information and work with it rather than against it. So a little bit now on the more nurture side of it. That was a bit of the nature, and these are just snapshots. There's many, many more aspects. I've just cherry-picked a few just to give you an idea. When we look at the idea of our upbringing and its relationship to our creativity, again, not that I'm wanting to pathologize creativity. It is not wrong. There are a lot of research papers and books that talk about the relationship between adversity in childhood and creativity. And by this, I don't mean by any means, outright trauma. We're not here to start throwing blame at parents and caregivers or anything like that. It's not about that. It's just about volatility, particularly if you come from a family of artists who, by our definition, are a little bit dysregulated. And we're up and we're down. We don't know if you don't know where you are as a child, you're like, what do I speak? Do I not speak? Right? You have to tiptoe around a bit. Your environment doesn't allow you just to relax and have all your needs met. Then creativity is often the result. So again, we tend to have this notion that growing up as a child is about acquiring more knowledge and gaining more intelligence. I would actually argue it's the opposite way. These are my truths, not forcing them on anyone. It's just another way to look at it. When we are born with all this connectivity, because the brain is not generating any of this. It's an antenna, right? We are connecting to the universal field of consciousness, if you choose to believe that, and drawing this information through us and blending it with our own unique stamp and then putting it out into the world in a reorganized way. So the brain isn't generating all of this. In fact, there are some interesting studies that show that there was one that sticks in my mind. It was in England, a guy who was, I think he was like a professor of mathematics or something at Sheffield University. So pretty intelligent guy, had a car accident, had head trauma, and they had to do a CT of his brain to check for injury. And it was shown that he had only 5% brain matter. The rest was all water. No one would have known if he hadn't happened to have to have a brain scan. So the idea that the mass of the brain is the, seat of our intelligence is not the case, right? Fluid is actually very intelligent. The water in the body, the fluids in the body are conductors of information. So when we look at as we're growing up, we're connected in, right? Kids are just in their imagination and creating all the time, right? Imaginary friends and games. Then as we get older, what happens is something called pruning. It's actually like you've got this big, incredible tree of connections in your brain when you start out as a kid. And what happens is we start pruning and pruning. This is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is bad, don't do this, do that. And we start to get our little bonsai tree so that it looks perfect. And now we're a good citizen, right? And how we fit in the cultural world. If you are a creative person, and if you have had some sort of volatility in your upbringing that just made you sort of feel like, oh, we're always on edge here, we're never quite sure where I am, you actually retain those connections because it's a great place to retreat to. You can go into your imagination and everything's good there, right? You can be in control there. So if there is control lacking out here, then we retain those connections, therefore we retain the creativity. So that's kind of the argument of the nurture side of things. But this is just an interesting study that shows how the sort of volatility in childhood can affect us on a physiological level, can actually affect how health outcomes if we don't become aware of it and do something about it. So significant adversity can produce physiologic disruptions or biological memories that undermine the development of the body's stress response. And in the second part this evening, we're going to be getting into the stress response a little bit more. But if we've had that experience, which has helped us be the creative beings that we are, we need to just do a little bit of housekeeping to make sure that this is not a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? We can do something about this. We don't have to have this as our end point, but we need to be aware of it. Awareness is everything. You can't change something if you're not aware of it. And then just the final slide for this part of the evening, another one that looked at social stress and targeted rejection. And this was particularly in adolescence that this study was done. And again, this is not particularly artists they were looking at. This is just regular people. But when I read the study, I was like, that just describes every artist I've ever known who went through kind of artistic training. I was in full-time arts training from the age of 7, and it tends to be a very whiplash, carrot and stick approach to not good enough, do it again, do it again, do it again. So social stress, targeted rejection. Yes, lovely, next. Yeah, how many times have we had that? So what this study showed was that if you are exposed to social stress and targeted rejection in adolescence, it carries health risks that are higher than for smoking, alcohol abuse, and physical inactivity. I'm like, where's the black box warning for that on your social media? Because the world that, I had enough of that. And when I grew up, we didn't have any of that nonsense, right? Any social media, it was just the people around you. It's just your peer group. But now, with this constant judgment, am I rejected? Have I got likes? Have I got, it's incessant right now. And as we see, it's correlated with a 20-fold increase in the risk of depression, leads to increased inflammation. We're going to be talking about that in the second half, and activates areas of the brain involved in the experience of pain. And as we're going to see later, pain is not a simple thing. It is very much dialed into our emotional expression. So that might make you feel like, oh, I can't, things wrong with me. Like, nothing wrong with you. just observations that might land with you and just go, oh, that's why, or that's what's going on. So we want to look at, well, what do we do about that? So I'm going to take you through a little exercise now as we lead into our first break. But just to put a sort of umbrella over these experiences that we have, it's about awareness. You can't change something, as I said, unless you're aware it needs changing. You don't know it's there. And this is part of this journey to the self. And unfortunately, again, for most artists, this is quite a difficult thing. A journey to the self, I'm very sorry, but it involves loving yourself. Really? Do I have to do that bit? Can I just like myself, maybe? But that's a big part of this, right? It's being able to know that you are enough, regardless of what you're doing with your talents and skills. You are enough underneath. So to kind of start us on that journey, and I wouldn't advise going straight to the mirror and going, I love you. You know, it's really not going to work unless you've already been doing that. It takes a while. But what we can do is start to have some appreciation for certain aspects of ourselves. And when we talk about emotions such as gratitude, appreciation, these are not just sort of whimsical woo-woo things. Oh, yes, it's got to be in gratitude. Blah, blah. They have physiological changes in the body. This is tangible, measurable stuff. And we measure emotions in the same way that we measure music. You're probably aware that music is measured in hertz, right? Hertz, and that every note has a different number of hertz correlated with it. The same for our emotions as well. And when we look at sort of low vibrational emotions, such as like anger, resentment, those have very low vibrational frequencies. The higher vibrational frequencies are gratitude, appreciation. But what that does on a biological level, I talked before about contraction versus expansion. That's all there really is. There is no up, down, in or out. There's just contraction, expansion in the universe. And when we're in contraction, we're not absorbing anything. We're pushing stuff out, which can be an issue for our digestive systems, as we will see later. But it's also for just being able to absorb information, as we're talking about, we need to be in expansion. And gratitude takes us to a place of expansion. You don't go, thank you, right? Yeah. So it's the emotions, the biology follows the emotions, and the emotions. So it's an intrinsically linked system. You can't really distinguish the two. If you walked around all day in a very contracted body language, you'll probably feel quite miserable by the end of the day. Whereas if you open the body up and make eye contact with people, you probably go, oh, I actually had quite a nice day today, right? So the emotions can drive the body language, but the body language can also drive the emotions. So we can use one or the other. I encourage you to become aware of, you know, if I'm feeling a bit down today, what's the body posture that went with that? Oh, well, maybe I could just do this. And suddenly it's like, oh, the world looks very different from here. Just subtle changes. But again, if you're not aware, you can't change it. Right. So we're going to do a little exercise now to help us connect a little bit with feet. And I'm going to perch myself down here because I'm going to get my foot going. Where's my... Oh, I always bring a spare. It pays to bring a spare. So we're going to get to know our feet. And we're going to appreciate our feet that carry us around all day in this... with all our body weight slamming about on concrete and then shoved into shoes. And our feet, we have 26 bones in our feet. You can come and have a look at this later, because the foot's designed to accommodate uneven ground, right? If we just had one bone in our foot slapping around, we'd be off balance, be falling over all the time. So it's there to help absorb all that impact. It's also a shock absorber, that it can take a lot more impact than just one solid piece. You're probably familiar with things like reflexology and things where they will map your entire, well, this is your liver and this is your spleen and your pancreas and all these things. It's all mapped on the foot. And I would correlate with that when I'm treating people, doesn't matter what they come in with, neck problem, shoulder problem, I start with the foot. And you can blind test me on any foot and I will tell you what's going on in the rest of the body. They've got jaw issues, they've got a blocked joint at the base of the spine. It's all there. So it's a microcosm of the macrocosm. Everything, you might notice I have these little Russian dolls here, and you might think, what on earth are these doing here? I've been studying unified physics and the physics of field consciousness for the last 4 years, because what else are you going to do in a pandemic? And everything in the universe is repeating scales. It's a fractal system, right? Everything repeats at scale. So the foot is a miniature readout of the whole body. We're going to get to know our feet. So if you are feeling like participating, you can kick off a shoe or a sock, and we're going to grab a foot, preferably your own. If you have back problems, knee problems, hip problems that preclude you from turning yourself into a human pretzel, I recommend spiky balls that you can actually roll under the feet. So, or you can get someone else to do it for you, people with a nice friend. But this is a great thing to do to help ground you. If you're about to go into a business meeting, an audition, something where you need to be grounded, this is a great exercise to do. So we're going to take a hold of your foot, and we're going to start off by just putting one thumb under your arch and your fingers sort of over the top of the instep there. And then you can put the other hand next to it, thumb under and over the top. So we call this the sort of midfoot and the forefoot. So we're sort of between the two there. And just give it a twist and get a sense for all those 26 bones articulating on each other and moving around and go back the other way. We should be able to have intrinsic movement of all these joints, and we tend to slap around without much movement under there. And as we're doing it, you can be like, thank you, my goodness, what you do for me every day, and I never take a blind bit of notice of you. Plus, it's not only that they get ignored, I'm a champion for feet. They need better PR, right? One of the things that people say, as soon as I get my hands on people's feet, the amount of people that apologize for their feet. Oh, I'm so sorry, my feet, I was really, I haven't had a pedicure. I'm like, don't apologize. So, how do your foot feel if it's like everywhere you go, I'm really sorry about it? So get to know them, get to appreciate them. So now we've had a little waggle of the foot. If you start around your heel bone here, just warp your thumbs under that arch, and it's probably going to feel, a little sore. So that pain is just tension in the system, inflammation in the system. Do they yell at you? They might do some days, but most days, they just hold the pain, hold the pain. So we're going to let that out, right? Walk around under there, get right up to the balls of the feet there, and wake up all those little joints there. And also, this is really important for our balance system. Remember I talked about efficiency, an efficiency drive. How little effort do we have to expend? If our feet are all nice and mobile and juicy, we have a lot more balance information for the brain to coordinate how we don't fall over more often. So if you're somebody that's prone to tripping and falling, this is another good exercise for you. Then if you come down to the top surface of the foot and just put your finger sort of between two toes, and you're going to run your finger up between, we've got these long bones called your metatarsals, a bit like the long bones in the back of your hand here, and they've got muscles, people, they've got muscles between them, a bit like the sort of webbing muscles, and they never get stretched, right, because they're just crammed in here. So see if you can run your finger between those long bones. We call this exquisite pain. It's like, oh. Okay, so now we're getting up to ninja level. Sole of foot, palm of hand, opposite. And you're going to put palm of one hand to opposite sole of the foot. Now you're going to thread a finger between each toe. And you might find some are more compliant than others. So you try and get in there. So we're going to shake hands with our foot. So still holding on with the other hand, give it a waggle and spread those toes out that get wedged into shoes all day. And it's like they're yawning. Oh, thank you. There's some space in there. So if anyone was a ballet dancer, you'll know this one well. We all do this before we put our point shoes on because, I spent a lot of my career standing on my toes. Really good idea. So after you've done that, you're going to pull those fingers out, and they might take some extracting if it's a bit tight in there. And now if we just come around that heel bone, just around your Achilles tendon there, and this is another joint that gets pretty tender, It's our main shock absorber because we tend to strike the ground with our heel. So if you can just pinch either side of your Achilles there, right on the top of that bone, and just push it away, yawn at the back of your ankle.
Are you pushing or pulling?
I'm pushing it away so that it's creating more space at the back of the ankle. So that's nice. So that joint relates to the joint at the top of the neck, between the neck and the skull. So that can often be really congested as well, particularly if we're on phones and computers all day. So this is helping to open your neck as well. And as we're going to see later, this is where our vagus nerves, there's another nerve that has a good PR agent, but we're going to tidy it up because it's not very accurate. So that's giving a bit of expansion there. Okay, so having done that, just put that foot down next to your other one and make some observations. How do they compare? This feels heavier. The one that you treated was lighter, yeah. Longer, yeah, so it feels bigger. Your awareness is expanded of it. Blood flow, vitality, just feels alive, right? And now look, have a check-in with the other one. Why didn't I get it? Poor feet, my goodness. So now we're going to stand up and see what they feel like weight-bearing. Do they feel the same size? Might find that one feels a bit bigger than the other. I mean, you might have a foot bigger than the other, but you probably find your footprint feels more grounded. So now we're going to do a little experiment, and you're going to stand on the foot that you haven't just worked on. Okay, so we're in a little balance here. And I want you to check in with what you're having to do to stay upright, right? This is our body's auto-correct system. So, forward a bit, back a bit, right a bit, left a bit. I'm just balancing a stack of plates. Whoop, 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 whoop. Yep, so there's effort, there's sort of activity going on. And now switch to the foot that you just worked on. Feel the difference in energy of the roots, like, that's called efficiency. All that extra effort just to stand up, a little bit useless, right? Why do we need that? So if you spend, what did we spend, like a minute on that foot, tops? If you did like 30 seconds on each foot before you put your shoes on in the morning or before you go into that meeting, we're grounded. Yeah? So we're using less effort to exist.